Hello, welcome to the Crime Survivor Speak podcast. My name is Aswad Thomas. I'm the National Director of Crime Survivor Speak. We are a national network of over 200,000 crime victims and survivors all across the country. If you haven't subscribed to stay up to date on the latest episodes, you can do that on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, or you can go to our website at www.cssj.org. I'm looking forward to this conversation to speak to another amazing leader in our survivor movement. Marlee Liss is a survivor. She's an award-winning speaker. She's a somatic educator and also the founder of Survivors for Justice Reform, which is a global survivor-led coalition advocating for restorative and transformative approaches to justice. After becoming one of the first sexual assault survivors in North America to have her criminal case resolved through a court-mandated restorative justice process, Marlee has dedicated her work to expanding survivor voices, expanding survivor agency and healing within the justice systems. Marlee is a leading voice in reimagining what accountability, repair, and true justice can look like for survivors of sexual violence. Marlee, welcome to the Crime Survivor Speak podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on and for all the incredible work you've been doing.
I'm excited over these past 2 years how we've been able to connect, and also we've got a lot of ideas of how we will partner together. Thank you for doing your amazing work all across the world. Marlee, I would love to start by talking about Survivors for Justice Reform. This is a coalition of organization you founded, which has grown into a global coalition all across the world. I would love to hear from you the most powerful things that you've learned from survivors in the Survivors for Justice Reform Coalition community.
Yeah, so many things. I think it's just really affirmed for me how powerful survivor stories actually are, real survivor stories, because I think about Netflix and true crime dramas and I see like the narratives being pushed there. And when we watch those shows, we see all of these survivors pushing for the courtroom, pushing for long prison sentences. And our culture kind of accepts, oh, okay, that must be what survivors want. But then, as I've seen and as your work has shown as well, when we actually turn towards survivors and ask people what they need after trauma, after violence or loss, we hear again and again, like people want healing. They want the violence to stop. They want reassurance that this harm won't happen again. And for me, the coalition forming it was very much about centering those stories, amplifying those stories. And I think it solidified for me how much power there is when we actually listen to survivors. And there's so many versions of why someone is advocating for restorative and transformative justice, for alternatives to that punitive approach. And the reasons people have of why they're advocating is just so powerful, right? Like people who have been failed by the criminal legal system, people who never felt safe going to law enforcement, people who always wanted healing rather than just punishment. These stories come out and they hold so much power. So I think for me, that's what really amazes me every single day is those stories.
As survivors, often we don't get those opportunities to share our stories. We don't get those opportunities to even weigh in on what justice looks like and what we would have wanted. And Marlee, you have one of the most incredible, powerful stories that I've heard in a very long time. And your story and your work has become a catalyst for deeper conversations across so many communities. We'd love to hear from you. Was there a moment when you realized your story wasn't just personal, but that it had the power to change how people think about justice?
So for me, like for anyone who hasn't heard it before, I experienced sexual assault, I experienced rape, and I started going through the court process, and I didn't know there was any other options. As I was going through this process, it felt like for 3 years, everyone was being more traumatized. I felt like I was being dehumanized. The person who harmed me, I was like, I don't see how this is going to make him a safer member of society. And so eventually I started researching other options and finally learned about restorative justice and started fighting for that outcome and was able to get a prosecutor to agree to it. And so that meant my assailant did 7 months of extensive therapy. And then we eventually met in this circle process. And restorative justice, the circle process that we did, has roots in Indigenous communities. It was incredible. Like, in comparison to the court process, it was night and day. Like, where court was traumatic and suffocating and made me feel smaller than a mouse, the circle was actually healing and empowering. And it clicked for me during the circle. Wow, this is so much bigger than myself. I think the reason that happened was because we were able to talk about harm in context. Like, the court kind of zooms in and acts as if violence comes out of the blue and people cause violence just because they're bad apples. But in this circle, we're actually able to talk about, why did this happen? What did my assailant learn in his life that led him to justify this degree of violence? And that opened the door for bigger conversations like rape culture and the ways that masculinity can be taught within patriarchy that's harmful to everyone. And we started talking about consent and power dynamics, and I was just so struck. This is healing, yes, for me as the survivor who went through this, but it also ripples out for both of us to impact everyone in our communities and in our lives. That was one really big moment. Another one I'll name is when I first went public with my story. And for me, like, the impetus for doing that was really, people deserve to know this option exists. I want to make sure they know about it. But I didn't expect the flood of messages I got from survivors of crime and especially of sexual violence. Thousands and thousands of people saying, I wish I had known about restorative justice. I wish I had known about transformative justice. I wish I knew there was an option beyond report to the police or do nothing. That made it so clear to me, like, oh, this is part of a much, much larger conversation. And just seeing how many people are wanting the violence to stop, are wanting processes that actually like eradicate harm instead of just transferring it from the victim back to the perpetrator. And it made me aware this is part of a larger movement that I was really just learning about as I was going. So those are two moments that stand out for sure.
Two powerful moments. Thinking about that process for you and your family, we'd love to hear, what does support look like for you?
Good question. It definitely looks like a lot of different things, a lot of like trial and error, forgetting I need support and then remembering I need support. But it's definitely looked like therapy, community care, reading and watching other survivors' stories, helping to validate our own. What I feel so privileged to have experienced by having restorative justice is like the justice process became a pillar of support for me. And it's usually the opposite. In our punitive context where we've been taught to see justice as courtrooms and gavels and prison sentences, usually when survivors are navigating that, it's so painful that we have to seek outside support to just heal from courtroom trauma. But for me, it was the opposite. Finally, like after years of that court process, it was like I finally got to have a justice process that was actually catalyzing my healing. And I felt that every step of the way. We use language like trauma informed, but it was so humane and caring. Every single detail was so intentional. Leading up to the circle itself, we'd have one-to-one meetings with the facilitators, and they'd ask, how can we make you feel even 1% more safe in the room? What snacks do you want in the room that day? What's a symbol you can use to indicate that you want to break? What do you really need after trauma? And how can we support in making that happen? The justice process became a pillar of support, which is a big piece of what I advocate for. Is we shouldn't, any of us, be complacent with a reality in which justice is an obstacle to our healing, it should be the opposite. It should be something we can lean into to support our healing.
And that's the system that we are trying to build, right? And so, Marlee, thank you for sharing what that process looked like for you. And we've had other guests on here, parents who've lost children to homicide, talk about restorative justice. As a survivor of gun violence, I advocated for the person that caused me harm, and you as well, as a victim of sexual assault and rape, also advocated for just an alternative process. So when you actually talk to crime victims and you listen to our stories and you ask us what would we like, it's not the traditional way of thinking of being tough on crime or just locking people up, right? And as you mentioned, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of survivors out there that want a better system. And for so many survivors, many of us find the traditional criminal legal system to be re-traumatizing, especially for sexual assault survivors. Pursuing a legal conviction often ends up delaying or even impeding a survivor's healing. So looking back on your own experience, can you speak about what felt misaligned between the conventional legal process and your needs as a survivor?
So many things felt misaligned. The moment I entered the criminal legal system, I didn't know there were options beyond report to the police or do nothing at all. That's what I was told my options were. So my sole reason for reporting was I don't want to do nothing. I went into that process and right away I felt how clinical and cold it was. At the time, I actually had written down the details of the sexual assault because that's what Google said to do. Like, I was in such a state of crisis and shock afterwards, and I looked up, what do you do after you're raped? And it said you should write down the details. And I did that. And I got to the police station and they asked me what happened, and I opened my mouth to speak and no words came out. I completely froze and I couldn't gather my thoughts at all. And so I said, can I just give you this piece of paper? Because I can't speak it out loud right now. And the officer said, yeah, sure. And he left the room with the paper. He came back without the paper and said, that's now being held as evidence. It's time for you to tell us what happened. And that was my first moment in the system that's supposedly like my justice, righting wrongs. And it was just like slap in the face after slap in the face. So right away, I felt like that glimpse of betrayal and, oh, is this for me? Is this for my healing? And that's one tiny example of what continued for 3 years of going through this process. It's not even really about me. I'm considered a witness in a crime done to the state, just there to provide evidence. So we talk about being survivor-centered. We can never be survivor-centered when the setup erases us completely and says it's the accused versus the state. We're not even in the picture. So how can we be centered? A huge, huge piece that wasn't there was consent. When we're addressing someone's consent being violated and we're saying we're doing a justice process for that, for me, there's nothing more obvious than making sure the process is consensual. But it wasn't. I was told you reported 3 years ago, and because you did that, you have to get up on the stand at this trial. And if you refuse to answer a question or you're unable to answer a question, you could actually be charged as non-cooperative. So not only does that not make space for trauma responses, but it means that we don't have a right to consent in a process where that's what we're supposedly fighting for. So not only was it re-traumatizing, but I'll often go as far as to say it's abusive, or at the very least, it's an abusive power dynamic. I remember feeling in the preliminary trial like I was the one on trial. My character was being questioned. My sexual history was being brought up as if it was proof I shouldn't be believed. Like, there's so much shaming and breaking of a person's character. And I tried to gaslight myself all the way through it, going this is so painful for me, but I'm told it's what I'm supposed to do to keep other women safe in the world. That's what we're told. And so I kept going through this painful process. But eventually, as I learned more and more about the system and prison and recidivism, I started to really question, is it true that working so hard to get my assailant locked up is going to result in more safety? Is it going to actually break a cycle of harm? As I gathered more understanding, I eventually came to the conclusion of no, actually, like what's going to end this cycle and make us more safe on a community level, make me more safe, make this man like a safer member of society too. It's healing, it's therapeutic intervention, it's a process that's actually going to support him in taking accountability and making change. It's not going to be acquittal or a prison sentence that leaves him less resourced and more traumatized, which we know makes people more dangerous.
One thing that really stood out that you've mentioned is like really focusing on healing, the therapy that survivors need, but also those who have caused harm need. You're from Canada, right, Marlee? And so you've mentioned you reported your crime 3 years ago. In the United States, states across the country have a victim compensation program. Victim compensation program exists in every state in the United States. If you have been a victim of a violent crime, you can get access to support like counseling. I'm curious, in Canada, does the country have a victim compensation program that provides that type of support to all victims to access counseling and therapies?
It's different in different provinces, but we have something where you can fill out a form after you report, and then you can get access. Like I got access to 10 therapy sessions. But we also know that less than 6% of people report. And the order of things is like you report and then you can fill out that form and then you can get access. So that's where I'm like, what if it was a little more broad, right? Yeah.
You talked about many survivors who don't know about their options. There's often confusion or even fear around restorative justice in cases of sexual violence. What are some of the biggest misconceptions you encounter about restorative justice as relates to sexual violence, and what would you want survivors to know about those options that might be available for them?
It's hard to pick a few, but let me try. It's interesting because I spoke at a conference once and there was a researcher there, and she had found that the biggest barrier to restorative justice was not funding, it was not legislation, it was actually misperceptions about restorative justice. And of course, misperceptions ripple out to shape funding and legislation as well. But it's these ideas people have that, oh, is it too soft on crime? Is it letting perpetrators off the hook? Do survivors really want this? What about public safety? And so I'm very passionate about speaking to those misperceptions. One I touched on already, which is what about public safety? I think we need to be really real about the fact that maybe we've gotten it wrong, or maybe we've been told a lie, because punishment clearly isn't keeping us safe, especially in America. The rates of mass incarceration, the number of people who are incarcerated, and then you look at the rates of crime, and we know if this really worked, America would be one of the safest countries. And so there's a lot we have to question around, does punishment equal safety? And often we find that punishment actually escalates violence. I think about Common Justice, an amazing organization in New York, and Danielle Sarid, the founder, she talks about how there are 4 core drivers of violence, from isolation to exposure to violence to unmet economic needs to shame. And when we focus solely on punishment and incarceration as a way of responding to harm, we put people in a pot of those 4 factors, and then we expect them to come out more safe, but we're making it almost a guarantee that they're going to be more violent. And we see that reflected in rates of recidivism and the fact that rates of sexual assault haven't declined in over 20 years. That's one piece. And then the other one is this idea that it's too soft on crime. I think we do ourselves a really big disservice when we get caught up in this debate of, is it too soft on crime or is it tough enough on crime? Because those questions don't really mean anything. And what I think would be a lot more meaningful is to ask strategic questions like, instead of is it too soft, asking, is it preventing future violence? Is it catalyzing healing? Is it preventing this person from doing this again? Is it addressing root causes of violence? Is it helping us create the world we want to exist in? So I just think redirecting that conversation and being really honest about the failures of the punitive approach, like I think that's really important.
I love that. And Marlee, you wear many hats, right? So
Yeah.
you are an advocate, right? You're an award-winning speaker. You're an author. You're also a somatic educator as well. You work with a lot of survivors all across the globe. In your work with survivors, can you talk about how trauma can live in the body and how has that understanding shaped the way you approach justice and healing?
We know trauma lives in the body. And for those of us who have been through it, we feel it in our breath. We feel it in our posture. We feel it in our cells. We feel it every single day. And it shows up for us in different ways. Different people respond. Some of us lean towards fight, flight, or freeze. And this shapes our every single day. Our culture is cognitive and heady, and we're so focused on what we're thinking all the time. And while that's important, it's like we can't just think our way through trauma. I can conceptualize, yeah, I deserve to be angry or it wasn't my fault, but it's a very different thing to actually feel the anger that's held in my body or actually feel misplaced blame that I've been carrying for years. I really feel like my biggest moments of healing, and I see this for all the survivors I've worked and connected with too, it's like in those moments where we feel what we haven't been safe enough to feel or process before. And there's certain environments that support us in accessing those feelings. And also it's about learning and realizing that big feelings are a sign of processing and healing. Like we're so taught, go to work, keep a stoic face on, even tying it back to the justice system. I was taught going into court, don't be too emotional, but don't be too stoic. A single tear down your cheek is great, but we don't want to see you hyperventilating. Then you don't seem as credible. We're given these ideas, right? And often it's in those big moments of release that we actually find a lot of healing. And so it's in the body. And for me, how that applies to justice and the journey I had is like, the moment I realized I needed to fight for something else, meaning not court and not nothing at all, that happened because I had a friend ask me, what would meaningful justice look like to you? And it was a question that urged me to turn toward my own body and like ask myself, what would it look like? And the answer was there. The answer was accountability, getting to voice the impact without censoring myself, getting to ask the questions I've held for years, getting to show up in an authentic way where I can be angry or sad or empowered or whatever I actually feel. And that directed me toward what I actually needed. And I think that's such a huge part of our healing, because if we're practicing self-consent, like meaning we're asking ourselves about our own boundaries and wants and needs, the information for that is in our bodies. So that's really where that somatic wisdom lies, is turning towards ourselves and listening to the information that our bodies are giving us.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing the importance of looking in ourselves and listening to our body as well. The limits of forgiveness. What is that? Tell us a little bit more about this new documentary about your life and your work, The Limit of Forgiveness. How did that come about?
It is a documentary that captures my story of restorative justice for sexual assault. Includes a roundtable conversation with 3 other incredible survivors who are all members of the Survivors for Justice Reform Coalition, and presents a wider call for us to make restorative justice more known, more understood, accessible. And it actually came about through doing a podcast. I did a podcast interview where I shared my story with Kelsey Dara on her podcast called Confidently Insecure. it completely changed her mind about how she talked about justice. She told me afterward that she had planned to get on this call and debate me and basically advocate for like a tough on crime approach. But instead, she was like, it completely changed my mind. And then a week later, she emailed and she was like, I can't stop thinking about your story. I've been having dreams about making it into a film. Is that weird? Would you be open to it? And same as you, I'm so passionate about making sure that there are these stories out there so that representation shifts, so that people can reimagine justice and healing and understand that not all victims of crime want the punitive outcome. So really shift the narrative. And to me, I was like, this sounds like an amazing way to do just that. And so we did it, and she did an incredible job of editing it together and making the conversation accessible, which is what I always want. I want it to be something people can understand because they felt something when they watched it, or they had a moment where they said, oh, I can relate to that. So they did a great job. So hopefully it'll be on some kind of streamer soon.
That's awesome. And how can people go watch the trailer?
Go to my Instagram, which is my name. So Marlee Liss, Marlee Liss. You'll see it's pinned at the top. The trailer's right there. They did such a powerful job. And the other survivors who show up in the film are really powerful. And I just think that restorative justice movements have often shied away from talking about sexual violence because it's seen as too controversial. And then sexual violence movements have shied away from restorative justice because of tough on crime narratives, and carceral feminism often comes from white feminism and things like that. And so this is really trying to build a bridge and saying these two movements need each other because what we've been doing isn't working.
Just a quick follow-up to that, to dive deeper into like some of those intersections, right? So how do you see restorative justice intersecting with broader movements like anti-carceral organizing, consent education, or gender justice?
To me, it goes hand in hand with all of these movements, really. We look at the sheer number of Black and Indigenous people being incarcerated right now. Restorative justice can play a really big role in disrupting mass incarceration, disrupting racial disparity in the school to prison pipeline, and ensuring people get resourced. And then in terms of movements of consent, it's really about setting a boundary of we're not okay with an approach to justice that crosses survivors' boundaries and re-traumatizes people. So it's about weaving consent into the way we do justice. And then it also is about a systems-aware version of justice because the court process is so individualistic, right? It has that bad apple sentiment as if violence happens out of the blue. But restorative and transformative justice, like these are movements that zoom out and get curious about the context of what led this person to cause harm. What systemic violence or oppression or poverty or trauma have they been through that's led them to this point? How can we get those people resourced so that they can start to heal and not cause violence again? And it's that community care piece. It's getting people plugged into the community rather than exiling them in the hopes that is going to solve things.
And you've provided a lot of wisdom and a lot of guidance to other survivors and advocates. This podcast often reaches elected officials, attorneys, or prosecutors, right? If a lawmaker or prosecutor were listening to this conversation and thinking about the criminal legal system, what is one structural change you believe could immediately make the justice system less harmful for survivors?
Again, that piece around misperceptions is so huge. And my full-time work now is like speaking and training people on this topic. And still the most common thing I hear from prosecutors, from corrections, from sexual assault nurses, the most common thing I hear is, I didn't know this existed. I didn't know restorative justice could be used for sexual violence. So there's an education piece that's missing that really needs to happen. And I really believe that if every single DA, prosecutor, sexual assault nurse, whoever is educated on restorative justice in a way that includes survivor-led storytelling, I really believe we'll start to see funding, legislation, and access shift. There are many provinces in Canada and states as well that have basically moratoriums that make restorative justice inaccessible for sexual violence survivors. So, for example, where I am in Toronto, our province has a Crown policy, D4. It says that restorative justice should not be used for sexual violence ever. That was actually used to penalize the prosecutor who helped my restorative justice outcome happen. People who are trying to be victim-centered, trauma-informed, open to restorative, transformative justice options in the system are being discouraged and penalized. We'd like to see those policies amended so that restorative justice processes are available to the survivors who want them. Another example is in the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. It says victims have a right to be informed of restorative justice on request. So that means in order to get information about it, we have to request it first. But if we don't know about it, how are we supposed to request it, right? Especially when we're in our moments of crisis. We need to see that shift so we're informed about it no matter what, and then we're giving access to it if we want it.
You know, a lot of our criminal legal policies, even the victim compensation program here in the States, in order for you to be eligible, you got to meet these time limits, right? You got to file a report within 72 hours in some states. You got a year to apply, or you have to fully cooperate with law enforcement, right? It's all of these things that are often tied to the justice system, often does more harm, especially to us as a survivor. I'm curious to hear from you. If you were to imagine a completely different system than our current legal system, one that truly centers survivors and values repair over retribution, from your perspective, Marlee, what would that different system look like?
There would be many justice options because we know that victims are not a monolith. We know that perpetrators are also not a monolith. I really believe in a needs-based approach to justice. When a survivor comes forward, we get curious about what are their needs. The most commonly reported victim needs tend to be accountability, reassurance the person won't do this again, getting to ask the questions that we have, getting some answers. So as victims share their needs, the system would be really honest about which justice pathway is most compatible with those needs, and then would connect the person with that approach. So let's say in my case, if we could go back in time and change it, I would be sitting in front of the sexual assault nurse who was the first service provider that I saw. And instead of her saying, at this point, you can either report to the police or go home, instead we would take a step back. She would get curious about what I actually needed. She would get a sense of what would truly be healing for me, and then provide me with all the justice options available to me. So that would include restorative justice. And then I would be able to choose the thing that works for me. So again, that's that informed consent piece. And it's about being transparent, not withholding information, making sure people know, because I really do imagine if that had happened, I would have saved myself and this man from 3 years of dehumanization and re-victimization in court. And instead, we would have gone to a restorative justice process. So I would love to see informed consent, letting survivors know about their justice options and taking that needs-based approach to be honest about which pathway is most compatible with their needs.
Well said. And for our survivors that are listening out there, we would love to hear from you all. What would justice look like for you all? What does healing look like for you all? What would a different system look like? So we would love to hear from you all. When we drop this episode, please engage with us in the comments. Marlee, this has been an incredible conversation. I'm feeling a deep sense of gratitude for your courage, your vision, your leadership that you bring to this movement. Your journey, your story, your advocacy, reminds us that survivors are not just people who have experienced harm, right? We are authors, we are trainers, we are leaders, we're innovators, we're advocates. We're also pushing for a new system centered on listening to survivors and also focus on healing and justice. Marlee, your story challenges us, right? It challenges the system to help us rethink what justice can look like. For survivors like us, we've been told to follow that one narrow path, right? But as we've heard from many of our guests on the podcast, that real healing could also be rooted in accountability, healing, repair, transformation, and also options, right? Like restorative justice as well. So Marlee, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited about the work that the Survivors for Justice Reform Coalition is doing. You're all across the world. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your wisdom, and for your commitment to expanding what justice can be for survivors everywhere. Before we wrap up, Marlee, we'd love for you to share where can people follow you on social media, the website. You're an author, you're an award-winning speaker, you have training curriculums, you got courses, how people can get in touch with you.
Thank you so much. Right back at you. You're doing incredible things in the world. Yeah, so a few places, my Instagram, my TikTok, my LinkedIn, my website, all of those are just my name, Marlee Liss, MarleeLiss. I do post about this stuff a lot, so definitely follow on Instagram and you'll find some resources there. I do have a free restorative justice resource guide, organizations, books, podcasts, documentaries on this topic. You can go to marleeliss.com/resource. If you want to learn more about the coalition or even get involved, it's Survivors for, the number 4, Justice Reform. That's our Instagram, and it's also our website, and you can join by filling out the form at our website. Hopefully, I'll have exciting news about the documentary soon, and I'll also have my book, my memoir on reimagining justice is coming out in about a year. So you never know when people are listening to this. Maybe it's already out there, but make sure you check it out because it's been a 5-year labor of love, and I'm very excited to share it. Oh, and I'm also a speaker, and I do this work for campuses, for conferences, for organizations, workplaces around the globe, and I really love sharing these messages of healing trauma, reimagining justice. You can also find information about that on my website, marleeliss.com/speaking. I'd love to collaborate, so please reach out and we can dream something up.
Thank you so much, Marlee. Thank you to all of our listeners. Until next time, keep lifting your voice, keep supporting one another, and keep believing in the power of healing and transformation. This is Crime Survivors Speak. I'm your host, Aswad Thomas. When survivors speak, change happens.